Welcome to today's episode of Just Call Dad, where we're building a team of dads who can be just a call away on a good day or a bad day, and all those days in between. We want to create a team that can help you, help me, and help our listeners become better connected and become the kind of dad who is able to be a call away. Today, I'm with Mikhail. Mikhail, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic, man. Thank you.
Awesome. And so I just had a little bit of time to get to know you before this podcast, and I was learning a few things about what you do. And I honestly don't know how you have the time to do all of it, but I want to hear some about this. You have this Blue Light Media, which is really cool, exciting stuff. You have this oversharing podcast, which I love the phrase oversharing. That's so fun. And then you have Echo Church, which is in Anaheim. And these are so many really great things that you're doing, but how do you have time to do all this? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what those things are.
Well, first off, I appreciate you having me on a lot. It's great to connect with you. And it's funny when you tell me that I don't have time to do it after learning that you have 3 girls under the age of 6. I'm like, man, I'm still a novice in this. But, I think the most important thing to being able to get all of those things done is just having an incredible wife who allows me to do all of those things. And so, when my son was being born, I asked her, I just need the mornings. I'll do whatever you want. I'll change every single diaper, whatever the case is, but I need from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. every morning, and then you can do the rest. And she's like, all right, bet. And so I made good on that promise for the first year. Now that he's a little bit older, well, he's still only a year and a half, that has divvied up a little bit, and it's a little bit more manageable. But I think that's the first thing, is having an incredible wife that allows me to work the way that I want to work. And then outside of that, honestly, I'm a routine dude. People ask how I'm doing. I'm like, it's kind of the same. It always elevates with that routine, but I'm a routine guy. And I think that preparation met with a little bit of diligence can really go a long way.
I love that. I'm a routine guy too. I notice if I get off of my routines, I feel a lot of anxiousness and then I get in those weird funks that I can't get out of. And I think routines help to navigate that. I think a lot of dads really thrive on routines. So I think that's awesome. So speaking of routines, what this Blue Light Media, I'm really intrigued by this. Let's talk about that for just a couple minutes before we get going so that our listeners and myself included can hear what is that and kind of what are some of your goals with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Blue Light Media is an end-to-end social media marketing agency. So my team, we handle content development, strategy, influencer marketing, paid and organic social, email marketing, and a lot of activities in between that for brands like, NutriBullet, GHD, Bulletproof, Rock the Bells, those types of things. And it's a company that I co-founded 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago now. And yeah, so in a nutshell, that's what it is. As far as what my goals are there, honestly, every day is just kind of being a better leader for these people. And then my personal mission is to create an environment where people can become the best versions of themselves professionally and personally. So, we have a tight team right now. We have 6 employees, and we are able to really dig into each other's lives. We're really great friends. I've officiated 2 weddings here. So I guess I can say I've officiated a third of my employees' weddings, but yeah, so having those types of friendships and being able to, kind of make a living while we do it, that was really the end goal when I started 10 years ago. The phrase was I just want to make money with my friends. And that's kind of what we do. And it's obviously evolved from there. And we're really focused on being the best social media agency for direct-to-consumer brands.
That's really cool. I think that a lot of people don't understand what it takes to run social media because social media is so overwhelming to people like myself. I'm just getting started on social media and I'm learning that there's so much good, but there's also a lot of things you have to kind of sift through and figure out. And some organizations, they aren't doing what you're doing, and that's organically trying to figure out how to help people. And that's one of the reasons I connected with you. I actually saw a post of yours running in a jogging stroller or with a jogging stroller with your son. And I was immediately, I'm I got to get this guy on the podcast because we're like-minded. Some of my best experiences are that. And it's interesting because I think trying to run something like that, trying to balance that, trying to create environments for people in a kind of a virtual space, I'm sure can be stressful at times. And so you have a little bit of a grounding where you're you're able to not only have your own podcast called the Oversharing Podcast, but also you pastor a church called Echo Church. And so maybe that kind of helps balance some of that, the things, the feeling of like, I've got so much to do, but you also can see that tangibility with the podcast and with the church. So is that true? Does that help you kind of keep grounded and kind of keep that connection?
Yeah, look, I mean, to clarify, so I'm the small group pastor over there, so I lead some of the small groups and I help with the sermons when our lead pastor is whenever he needs help with that.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, and oversharing is great too. So oversharing is definitely, well, something that for the moment I've actually put on the back burner, not the back burner, but I've taken a pause maybe for seasons. Like I've produced over 350 episodes of that over the course of like 5 or 6 years, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of love. And as podcasting has gotten a lot more complex, as you know, it used to be I could just plug in a mic and like load it up to Apple Music, but now it's like you have to produce this whole TV show. And I've kind of gotten to a place where I want to be able to deliver the best content possible in formats that people are consuming it. And that was something that wasn't necessarily helping my business, helping, my family, helping the church. That was more of a passion project of mine. So I'm definitely going to be revisiting that by the middle of the year. So that was nice as a creative outlet. On the church side at Echo, it's just great to be in community. There's definitely a lot of pouring into other people as well. It's another form of leadership for me. So, and if I'm being honest, it can be a little bit taxing sometimes. But, my wife is in it with me as well. She leads our small group and serves the church quite a bit as well. And so yeah, like it takes a lot, but then, to be honest, every time I think about it, I'm like, well, we're called to serve people. You know what I mean? And so that the energy that goes into that is like, hey, when I recognize essentially what was done for me, like it doesn't become that hard to lead a small group. You know what I mean? So yeah, like there's definitely balance there, and I go through phases of honestly like feeling depleted and feeling filled up, but I think that's just normal. That's life.
Yeah, I think that's life. And I think anybody who serves, so I'm an educator, I'm a coach, I do a lot of serving. And I think sometimes our serving can fill us up, but it can also kind of take from that cup. So it's interesting. It's like this, it's like almost filling up and taking at the same time. And it's a pattern, and we have to kind of go seasonal with that. And I think that's really cool that you're looking at it that way. And again, my wife and I, we share a lot of the load. And I like to always say, I'm actually the assistant coach in the marriage. I truly like to be that support role. And I like to look to her for leadership. She's a quiet leader. I'm a loud leader. And so that's pretty cool because sometimes your quiet leaders are the ones that help direct your steps. And I know for me personally, I need that perspective. And so it's honestly just maintaining that perspective and that pace that takes to really keep up with yourself and your goals. I mean, as blue light media takes off and I see you doing so many cool things, like I was just, like I said, following some of that, I'm excited. And as that podcast kind of ebbs and flows, those things are always going to happen. But I really like that concept of like, hey, if I'm in a church body, if I'm part of this, it just gives me somewhere to belong. And I talk about that with all of my podcasts, people that come on here. Everybody has different walks of life. Not everyone who's going to listen to this podcast would go to church. And so maybe this could be a really cool experience for them to just be part of our fellowship today as we chat and we talk and we're real, with each other through this. And I like to do a segment on my podcast called Take Five. And you and I kind of talked about this. We say, all right, we're about 10 minutes in. We introduced everything. We have everything kind of talked about. We know who you are. And before we do Take Five, let me just quickly tell you a little bit about me so that then that can kind of guide your Take Five. So as a dad of three, this podcast began for me when our youngest daughter was in the NICU. And so 2 years ago, we walked through a season where we were really struggling. My wife was in the hospital for an extended time and my daughter was after. And I got this passion as a dad in the NICU to write books. And so I noticed that I couldn't hold my daughter at first, but I could read to her and she could hear my voice. And there's something powerful about being able to do that. And now I'm trying to work alongside other NICU organizations and other people who are leading from that area and helping to do these things for dads. Because even if you don't have a NICU experience, we all have these stressful experiences as dads. And something that we can do is, number one, tell our story. Number two, read a book. And number three, just every day, pause and take five and be a better version of ourselves. And so during this 5-minute little segment, I'm curious for any listener that's out there, what would be one thing as a dad, as a pastor, as an owner of a business that we could talk about that might be very powerful and might mean something to a dad who is listening to this, who may be going through something good or bad or somewhere in between?
Sure. Um, I have one, but it kind of breaks off into two, so I feel like that's cheating. And first of all, I didn't know that about your story, and I'm over here like trying to hold it back. Like, for one, just like the strength of you and your marriage and your family is so incredible and it's inspiring to me, and I'm instantly humbled, by like, I'm just like, man, whatever I'm going through, you know what I mean? It's like you're the type of person where it's like I can click into that and be like, yeah, whatever I'm going through, like I know somebody else did that, and I think that maybe I could too, you know what I mean? So thank you for continuing to be strong through all that, and then looking at that as an opportunity to serve others as opposed to, stepping back. So for me, the two things that I think are really important to me in this walk of my life as a parent, and maybe everything else that I'm doing, is one, breaking generational cycles, and two, the leader spiritually in my household. And the reason that I say that that's actually kind of the same thing is because I grew up in a household where my mom really led that. And while, that was beautiful, we were in church, we were introduced to God, we were introduced to Jesus because of the work my mom did. My dad, was kind of, he wasn't pushing that forward at all, and there was no real structure around how he approached his faith or anything like that. And my dad's a great guy, by the way, but that was just not his role. And I think that when I look at a lot of other families, maybe not now because I'm a little bit more like, in community with other people who are of the same mindset as I am. But when I look at some other families, I'd venture to say that a lot of the women drove the spiritual aspect of it. And so that's something that I really want to change. And by focusing on being a spiritual leader in my household, it helps me break some of the generational cycles that I, plan to break or wanted to in the first place, or things that, quote unquote, maybe, I don't want to say like I would have done better or anything like that. That seems pretty arrogant, but maybe fill some gaps that I wish I had as I was growing up.
I love that. Let me go right into that with something that I talked to Mark about yesterday. So I don't know, you may or may not have encountered Mark. Mark's from British Columbia, so I'm gonna guess you haven't. I'm from Ohio, so it's kind of crazy the connections we have. But he has a thing called Mentally Fit Dads. Super cool.
Mm,
He's on my podcast. He's gonna be one of the episodes that we're gonna drop here too. And he talks about the same thing you just talked about, of dad mode. There's like this dad mode that we go into, and it's this, like, there's a spiritual element to that dad mode. It doesn't really matter, where you come at it from. Yes, you and I are coming at it from the Christian perspective, from the faith, from those avenues. But there has to be, as a dad, you have to have something that's like bigger than you, that's your goal to break that cycle, right?
mhm,
You can't just look at today. And so a lot of my books that I write, I'm working on one right now. It's going to be released in April. It's called The Emotional Shoes. It's a kid's book,
mm,
and it's an allegory, or a story, if you will, however you want to go about it, a metaphorical story for a girl named Mia, who's mirrored after my daughter, walking through her NICU experience, who gets emotional clothes that give her emotional power. And I think as dads, I'm super excited about it, by the way. Like, it could be, that book could be in the NICUs being read by parents to their kids, so I'm super pumped. But what it does is, it's that concept of, like, there's an emotional component to strength that I think a lot of dads are afraid of. And I think what you just kind of hit on right there is, there's mental muscles. And that's what Mark was talking about. And I think that's really what you're talking about too, is this concept of, like, okay, in order to break a cycle, in order to be a leader, I have to develop those muscles. So how are you daily developing those spiritual muscles, those mental muscles that are allowing you to break the cycles that you want to break and become the leader that you want to be for your family?
Man, what a question. By the way, like as I'm talking about all this, I'm like, as we're talking about this, I'm like, wow, I really want to interview you on my podcast.
Sounds good, man.
Yeah, you have such an incredible story. So what I'm doing, really what I'm doing on a daily basis, always, 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 always starts with, just solitude and time in the Word. And sometimes it's reading like the same passage like over and over throughout that time. Lately, prayer has looked a lot different for me, in that I'm not at, I still end up asking for things because I'm human. But there's also a lot of time in silence. And maybe to the person who isn't praying on a daily basis, this could look like meditation. But instead of me trying to guide where I'm going to go, I'm doing the best I can to allow, God to guide that for me. And so some days it starts with reading the Word first, then prayer, and other days it could be starting with prayer first, then the Word, or a combination of the both, whatever it is. And that really sets the tone for the entire day. So it looks like, one, it's just quiet time alone, reading scripture, and then also reflecting on that as well. And that can show up as journaling, that can show up as, a devotional, whatever the case might be. And then constantly inviting God into everything that I'm doing, again, as much as I can, you know what I mean? And it grows daily. Before it was like, okay, it's just the beginning of the day and maybe before a tough call. But now, this muscle is developed, and sometimes it's before an email, before even a short like check-in meeting, like all these things, like not even like, hey, like God bring me peace to give me discernment in this, but like, let me see if there's an opportunity to glorify your kingdom through all of that. So that's one of the biggest things. And then also like, kind of outside of spiritually, like I'm a wannabe boxer as well. So every single morning, minus Sundays, I'm working out pretty intensely and really pushing my body and my mind as much as I can within reason, because, I don't need like CTE when I'm not getting paid to do any of that stuff. So, but really pushing my body and mind as much as I can, because I truly believe that if I can get up in the morning and, just from a very practical sense, if I can get up in the morning, meet up with a bunch of dudes and we go 6 rounds of sparring, or I run 5 miles, 6 miles, whatever the case might be, if I can do something like that, the rest of the day should be relatively easy. You know what I mean? Like I work from a laptop most of my day. It's not going to be like too challenging, but constantly pushing myself in other areas of my life to get a little better really informs how I am, how I show up for the church, how I show up for Blue Light, and how I show up for my family.
I love that. And I think one thing that I also love about that is the honesty in it, is that, there's not necessarily an answer to that question. And I asked that without really expecting much, because I think the answer changes seasonally too. I think it changes based on where you're at mentally, what you need. For me, I used to be like that physically. I mean, I coached athletes at a high school, but at a high level. I
Mm,
trained, I would run half marathons, and then I pulled up with a crazy injury last year. And
mm,
then, like, my entire morning routine had to change because I could no longer work like that. I worked like that for years. And then I actually had to take the same effort that I placed in physically into my body for 35 years. And then
mm,
for a year's time, decide how can I put that same level into my spiritual walk, into my mental walk. And it was interesting because the doctor will say different diagnoses. For me, it's anxiety. For other people, it's different things. And when we get those types of labels that are placed on our life, we have options, right? It's like someone saying, hey, you're not strong enough, or hey, you're not fast enough. But at the same token, when you receive that, you're either motivated or you're demotivated, right?
mm,
And so for me, over the last season of my life, I've had to put the same amount of effort emotionally that I put in physically. And I think a lot of times as dads, as we kind of transition out of the take five into this conversation that we're having, I think we're afraid to have that vulnerable conversation of, hey, I'm not good enough. Hey, I don't
mm,
have what it takes. Hey, you know what? Like, I can't do A, B, C, or D, but you're not even thinking about the fact that those things are not your identity. And as I listen to you talk and as I think about where I'm at, I actually jotted down how cool would it be to make an app with prayer with work to rest ratio, where you could have people pray throughout the day with a work rest ratio. It's whatever that is. Like, think about how you could do that kind of stuff, and with the media that you do. And so maybe we could even talk about that just for a minute. When you're going through your day, is there a work rest ratio that you're able to maintain? You start your day
mm.
with that challenge, you have your mindset going. What happens when you reach that hiccup, that hurdle that I talk about in my books, that mental hurdle? Maybe it's a conversation you don't want to have with somebody. Maybe it's a conversation you do want to have. How do you kind of readjust after you had that great win in the morning and then you reach another hurdle? What is a strategy that you use to kind of get over that? And then we'll transition kind of through that, how as a dad, as a leader, you can kind of go whatever direction. But how do you get through that or over that hurdle?
Yeah. So my strategy is pretty simple there. It's honestly facing it head on and as quickly as possible. I think that, everybody has their own challenges in life. And by the way, this is like this is taking into consideration daily challenges. Like, thank God I haven't had to deal with, sickness in my family or anything like that. I haven't had to deal with, a tremendous amount of loss or anything like that. I've gone through some, financial issues, those types of things, but those are just kind of like financial issues. But the faster you can address something and then also not tiptoeing around it, the easier it's going to be. Because what happens is it's just like anything else. We end up, the longer we let something linger, it turns into this like mental monster that haunts you. You know what I mean? But every single time, what I've noticed is every single time, no matter how big that challenge might be, the second we face it, we realize it wasn't that big of a monster in the first place, you know? And so after noticing that over time, I realized like we just have to have this conversation. Like even if it's not perfect, you know what I mean? We just have to have this conversation. We just have to send that email. We just have to make that phone call, like whatever the case might be. Or, we just need to make this adjustment. Like yeah, everything always ends up being a bigger problem than it is if you push it off, So that's really the biggest thing for me. And obviously now just being intentional about how I do that and just making sure that my character isn't compromised in any of those things, and if it is a larger issue, a very complicated issue, I do have a community of people that I reach out to kind of spot check what a response might be or what my approach might be, both from a spiritual sense and like a practical sense.
I think that's cool. And what I like about that piece too is, first of all, if you haven't considered writing a kid's book, I'd love to help you write The Mental Monster because that's sweet. That's awesome. And I want you to think about how powerful that would be for your son. If you could write a book called The Mental Monster that you could help him kind of deal with it, I think that would be so cool because it is like that. It's like this mental monster that we see in the distance, and it's really a big old shadow. And if you look at it, it's just a tiny little speck. And I think that's such an interesting like analogy to think about it. And when you're attacking something head on, it's that bison idea. It's running into the storm. It's not backing down from the storm. The storm is going to be maybe harder, but it's going to be shorter. And I like that concept that you've talked about. It's like we have to attack it. But also
Mm,
I like the concept that, and we're kind of in this real talk without even meaning to, my segment that I like to talk about these like 30-second thoughts of like somebody taken away is that mental monster. Like what is it for you? It might not be the same thing for me, right?
yeah.
We might have a different mental monster, but our approach to that mental monster should be the same. And that's simply this, like we have to first identify it, right? Okay, what is it? Number two, we have to attack it. And number three, we have to surround ourselves with community. And at Just Call Dad, that's kind of what I want to do. I want to create this team where it's like, man, I reached a mental monster today. I remember listening to Mikhail talk to Sean about like, hey, he reached this. I'm gonna listen to that. I'm gonna see what
Mm.
did he say. I know he's not a therapist. I know he's not paid to do this, but like honestly, they're gonna listen more to you because you're a dad walking through that. So if you have a day like that, that's you just feel heavy. You feel like you had a lot to do. Maybe there was some things at work that you didn't get done. How do you go home now to a year and a half year old, now that it's kind of a newer experience for you? And how do you turn your brain off so that you can truly be present with him? Have you noticed that being a challenge for you, or are you able to do that well?
It wasn't, it was between the maybe months 0 to like 8. But now that he's a lot more interactive, it's a lot easier to turn that off. And so, man, honestly, he's such a joy. So it becomes kind of easy. So a lot of what I do is like compartmentalization as well. Like when I'm done with work, like 90% of the time, like when I leave the office or when I'm not in like work mode or something, like I'm not working. I'm with my son at this point. You know what I mean? Of course I drift, like just being an entrepreneur in general, like I'm going to drift. I'm going to think about issues at work, those types of things. But again, after 10 years, being rooted in faith, like I know that everything works out. I know that I leave the office doing everything that I could that day to make sure that we're in a good position. So, and what I've realized is that, you know, especially like we deal with like a lot of corporate companies. So this is very like maybe niche is like, yeah, me sending an email like on Saturday or whatever is not really going to change anything, and it doesn't communicate to anybody else that I care more. It doesn't actually do that. Sending an email on a Saturday, to me, most of the time, like if you're going to work, cool, work in private, schedule that email to go out on Monday morning, whatever the case might be. To me, what that communicates is that I don't have respect for somebody else's boundaries, and I also don't have my own time management systems or values put in place to where I can actually separate that. So I think that's something that has to change regularly. So back to your question about like how do I focus on my kid? If I do feel myself drifting, I pay attention to one small thing on him. So it could either be like the way that his hair is flipping, it could be, the laugh that he has or how he's eating that day, and it could be something as like I don't care. I'm a dad and I love my kid. Like he still has those like little fat rolls on his thighs. Like and that brings me so much joy. You know what I mean? So really honing in and paying attention to something like that makes it a lot easier to detach from everything else that might be going on.
It's adorable, first of all. I love that.
You know
And
exactly what I'm talking about
I
too.
do. I do. If I could tell you one thing from a dad of three girls who I look back sometimes and think about all the things I could have done better, it's exactly what you just said. Don't lose that. I started the same way and I lost it. I lost it somewhere along the way. And starting this journey was for me trying to get it back and trying to help dads see that. I'm not here to provide advice. This is more of a conversation podcast, but good on you and keep it up, dude. I mean,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Yeah. We've gotten really great at managing our life. Well, our life with one toddler. And I'll tell you before I tell most people, which is hilarious, but we have another one on the way in May,
Let's
the first
go.
week of May, and it'll be a little baby girl as well. So
Let's go, man.
I might be DMing you for some advice, to be honest. So
Oh,
like, it all sounds really
absolutely.
great with one,
Yeah.
but we'll see with two.
Well, what's cool about this podcast is I feel, and I'm just going to say it transparently, I feel that God is bringing me people into this story that I'm trying to tell. Whether you believe that or not, whether you believe universe, God, whatever you believe, for me, that's what I choose to believe. And it's helping me not only tell the story, but it's helping me build the brand without even really meaning to. It's like
Mm,
an accidental brand building. And I love it. I just honestly jumped on here and said, I want to talk about some things that matter to me. And the first thing that matters to me is the exact thing you said. And so if you could I'm just going to really tell you some things that you've said today. And one of the things is one small focus. So the next sermon you do or next lesson you do, you should really think about using that as a sermon title. One small focus. I love that. Like, because think about focus. In my books, I talk about focus, train, and build are the three pillars for great athletes. And so I write a book called Design to Compete that's also coming out in the spring. And it's actually geared towards mental competitors. And so we design your emotional competitor in your own mind. And so we're
mm,
hopefully going to work with some high level athletes using my framework. But that focus, train, and build framework is kind of what I like to go, because you have to focus, you have to train your focus, and you have to build your focus. Like it's a process, but it has to start. I love your idea of one small focus, because as a dad, and specifically speaking to your story, as you get multiple, kids into your story, your focus widens and
mm.
you're unable sometimes to see what that specific child needs, and you're unable to truly attack whatever your calling is because your focus widens. So we have to train our focus to actually narrow, and I love that concept. So I think that could be a cool sermon or a cool motivational speech,
Yeah,
is one small focus. And I
appreciate
love
that.
that idea of mental monster too. That's something that I just am going to take away from this conversation with you, because I teach elementary school. The better we can be tangible with our fears, the easier they are to go away. And I think fear is one of those things that when it's not tangible, it's terrifying.
Mm.
And when it is tangible, it's much less terrifying because you can put a name on it, you can put a label on it, you can put a face with it, whatever it is, or put an emotion with it. And so I think that's really cool. And I want to go back to one thing here as we finish up our real talk and we kind of end for our 30 minutes. We don't want to bore too many dads. We don't want to go too long. You and I could talk all day. I'm finding I'm just like enjoying talking to these people on my podcast. So we can talk anytime you want. But on this podcast, what I want to do is end with this concept. You talked about breaking generational cycles. So I want
Mhm.
to end with a message to our listeners, because I know this. I know there's going to be a guy, a dad, well, maybe not a dad, but somebody listening to this podcast who is stuck in a generational cycle. And I want you to just quickly, or as much time as you need, talk into somebody's story right now. Say, this is what you know is true and what you've seen in your life about breaking a generational cycle, so they know that there's hope for them too.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that maybe come up with a lot of men, especially in this day and age, is that we have to lead our sons. And I'm going to speak specifically to sons. That's been my experience, and
Yes,
this
do
kind
it.
of what I'm going to. We feel called to lead our sons with a lot of vinegar and a lot of like hard rules and a lot of standards, and thinking that we have to be like a drill sergeant with our sons to produce a strong man. And that is not the case. I don't believe that is the case. Sure, maybe in some moments that's definitely going to be true, but I think that there's something to be said about leading with as much strength as you do compassion. Because at the end of the day, we all have emotions that we need to process. And if we can't talk through those, if we can't express those, and if we can't and if we can't express them to our father figures, then we're never going to know how to navigate those things in a healthy way. So that could be a feeling of low confidence. That could be a feeling of incompetency, which I guess maybe is like synonymous with that. But it can also be these feelings of overconfidence, of arrogance, things like that. And so that quick correction can be kind of helpful, and that hard correction can be helpful. Feel comfortable having drawn out conversations around what your son might be feeling. because at the end of the day, like those are going to be the leaders of our future, whether it's they're just leading their family, whether they're leading 300 kids at an elementary school, a small business, whatever the case might be. Those are the leaders of our future. And the way that we can impact other people is by approaching everything with empathy. And so that's something that, again, I think my dad did a great job with what he had. But as I see some other dads around me right now, I think that might be something that might be missing a little bit, is that empathy portion and having long conversations about how somebody feels. And yes, creating boundaries around your standards for what it is to be a man. You know what I mean? To whether it's something as small as like opening a door for a lady, or something as big as like, hey, we face our problems head on. We tackle our mental monsters, you know, we don't hide from them. Like those are things that are important too, but there's so many intricate feelings in between those that I feel like gets neglected sometimes.
So you just hit on why I started the podcast, which I love. So I'm sitting here smiling because I'm going to be transparent with you for a second and tell you that the reason I actually started this was 2 years ago, the whole process started. And then about a year ago, I had a massive panic attack.
Mm.
I had never been through it before. I didn't know what it was. I thought I was dying. I actually wrote a book about it called Just an Anxious Dad. And I'm hoping that it can help other dads who might be going through this as well. And I thought, what am I going to do? In that moment, even though my dad is awesome, but he's imperfect and he did not express emotion as much as he does now. Seeing him with my daughters is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And I don't want to get emotional, so I'll just stop there with it. But I'll say this, I've always been more emotional than him, and he's never understood me, if that makes sense. And he's always tried, he's always coached my teams, he's always been there for me, but we never had an emotional connection until I called him when I had that panic attack. He was the first call. He came to my side. He stood beside me as I was going through it. And I'll never forget him telling me, son, I've been there too. And it was really powerful because I never thought my dad had gone through something like that. Like I always thought he was strong, and he had. And not only that, he'd gone through worse than I'd even realized, because it opened the floodgates of us to be able to talk through that.
Mm.
And so Just Call Dad is all about that. It's all about, what if there is a story that has just been left untold? And if it was told, it could change a life and it could change a story for someone else. And so as leaders, I don't have sons, but I have the privilege of working with young men in what I do. And I could not agree with you more. I mean, that is the most fantastic thing. We have to teach our sons to be strong without being the strongest in the room.
Mm.
Strength is not about what we have always said. And so I love that. And I think if someone listens to this podcast to this point, and if they hear just that they can be the dad that can be a call away. Or maybe I had one guest that came on and called his dad after the podcast and they reconciled. And I was like, wow, that was not even the intentional goal, but like it worked. And it was powerful. I got emotional about that. And so I guess what I'll end with is two things. Number one is, I want people to be able to find you, find your content, find Blue Light Media, if that's something they're interested in. So number one, how can they find you? And number two, are there any parting messages that you would have for any guests that have listened this far into the podcast?
Yeah, well, first, if somebody wants to connect, everything on social is MIQK, so that makes it relatively easy. And as far as a parting message is concerned, I think just take time, take time in everything. At least where I live, like everything's a rat race. And, my neighbors are not my literal neighbors, but our neighbors in LA. I'm in Orange County. My neighbors in LA are, they're going through a lot right now with the fires. And there are memories that were built in those areas. There's, even just passing by, driving through, those types of things. And take the time to notice really how beautiful life is in this moment, because we have no idea when something like that could go away and to what magnitude it could. And, I have the blessing to have been able to accomplish a lot in my business and for myself personally, like those types of things, but nothing compares to the time that I get to spend with my wife and my son. It's kind of weird, like at the Irvine Spectrum over here, there's like a merry-go-round, right? And we were just on that. I see my wife on the side taking pictures of me and my son, and I'm just kind of holding him up on the horse that goes up and down. And something as simple as that, a $5 carousel ride, I thought to myself, I was like, oh my gosh, this might be the best day of my life. And I think we miss it so often because we're trying to take the picture instead of just taking a moment.
Yeah. Well, you got me emotional there because I thought of the note that my grandma, she passed away 8 weeks ago, and it was a crazy battle that she had, but she was one of the strongest people that I knew. And we found a note in her drawer, and this is how I'm going to end today's podcast. And in the drawer, it was handwritten by her. It said, "I hope that you have sunshine tomorrow. And it got me thinking about this idea of like every day I have, I get it tomorrow. And so I'm not guaranteed it, but I get a chance at it. And I don't have to worry about yesterday. I don't have to worry about tomorrow. I can live today and I can trust for sunshine tomorrow. And even if that sunshine looks different than I expected, that phrase sunshine for tomorrow tells you, it tells me, it tells our listeners to never give up. That your best days, they are ahead. They are ahead of you, and you have what it takes to be a dad. Even if today you're hurting, even if today was the worst day of your life, you have better days ahead. And so, Mikhail, thank you so much for that. Thank you for your words of wisdom. And dads, as always, this Just Call Dad podcast is about just being a call away. Trust that you have sunshine for tomorrow and that the hope that you feel will last you through any circumstance. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Just Call Dad. As always, make today the best version of today. Stop, take 5, and take time to be the best version of you so that your family and everyone around you can be there when you need it, but better yet, you can be there when they need it too. All right, thanks for listening.